Hi, my name is Elizabeth Scheiling, and I am here to talk to you about past disciplinary policies in the U.S. and how some of those are starting to change now, and kind of at the same time, the patterns that we see reflected in youth violence, specifically school violence. And that, of course, as we've mentioned, ranges from everything from cyberbullying all the way through to homicide and suicide. We'll be looking both at the rates of that happening among youth in general and also how much it happens at school, on school property, to and from school events. Seen in the past about 3 decades, from the 1990s up to the present, a really massive shift in how we look at school violence, the causes of school violence, and how to best address them. And obviously there's a lot of lag in the systematic changes. Those don't happen very quickly, but we're starting to see some really innovative techniques in changing how schools address discipline. So for historical context, we're going to look pretty much from the 1990s, 1992, up to 2016, because the data for 2017, 2018 really isn't in yet, and the CDC provides pretty consistent statistics about the rates of school violence, the rates of violence that youth experience in general. At the same time, it's important to start in the 90s because this was an era of a lot of federal policy change around how discipline should be approached. The federal government really stepped in. There was a lot of fear about increasing rates of youth criminal activity, of school violence, and this idea of some teenagers being super predators. And so they began to enact zero tolerance policies, which have been repealed in the past decade, and we've started seeing different disciplinary policies come into play. So we'll talk a little bit about those later. I want to go over some of the statistics about what we actually see happening first. The CDC and the National Center for Education Statistics has collected data on the number of violent deaths, the rate of crime experienced at schools and outside of schools for youth and other people who are involved in schools. So we're going to look at a couple tables that show us how those patterns have changed over the last 30 years. The first thing to notice is that when we're looking at deaths, most of them occur outside of schools. So in 2014, 2015, 1,168 homicides occurred. 20 of them were at school. Most of them were away from school. Okay. This graph shows that school deaths have been rather level. There's been a slight decrease. The top line is showing all deaths, so staff and other non-students as well as students, and then the bottom ones show students as well. So you can see this kind of gradual decrease. At the same time, you see a very slight increase in the number of suicides that are occurring on school grounds. So those numbers are all the ones that actually happened on school grounds, not the ones just experienced by people within that 5 to 18 age range. It's important to not just look at the solid numbers, but to look at the rates. So this is looking at the rate of violence and of theft and of serious violence in schools, this first table, and then this next table shows out of schools for all of these years, 1992 to 2014, 2015. You can see general decreasing trends. Most of this data relies on students reporting when they are victimized by a criminal act. So this looks at that, again, decreasing percentage of students who are reporting being victimized, being the victims of theft, being the victims of violent victimization, and serious violent victimization, which includes things like rape and deadly or near deadly attacks. Okay. That serious rate is the one that has shown the least decrease, but it's also the one that started the lowest. This one shows the rate of victimization reported by students of different backgrounds, ethnicities, sexes. One of the things to note about these next couple graphs is when we're no longer looking at deaths at that serious level of violence, the rate that students experience crimes is higher at school than it is at home for the most part, with the exception of violent crimes happening to students aged 15 to 18. They experience a higher rate of violence outside of school property. But this is consistent with, so it's important to remember that even though these rates are higher at school, and that is a really big issue, they still are reflective of a general decrease in school violence throughout the decades. So again, it's really decreased a lot from the early 1990s through to the present with everything. There are a couple places where it's stayed about the same. specifically so students who are threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. This has stayed fairly constant from 1993 to 2015. So what have been the different disciplinary rules and kind of settings that we've moved through as we've seen this general decrease in school violence, in school crimes? Again, even though students still experience a higher rate of victimization at school rather than at home for especially the nonviolent crimes or the non-lethal ones. What have been the changes in our systems that have kind of followed along with this decrease? In 1993, part of the laws that created those zero tolerance policies was enacted, Bill 987. And what this basically said was that students found on school campuses with firearms were expelled for 1 year. States were still responsible for providing education for these students in an alternative setting, and suspensional terms could be modified if such a modification was made in writing. So there were ways for schools to get around this, but this is an example of the kind of law that was enacted because in response to things like the super predator team. It mandated federally a response to a specific type of event happening in a school. A lot of those federal mandates have been repealed, especially in light of the unequal ways that those rules kind of were enforced on different minority groups and groups that have special needs. So students who are protected under the IDEA Act, we see higher rates of discipline for those students and also for students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds other than white. So those federal mandates have been changed. Schools have more flexibility in what they do now for student discipline, and a lot of them are turning to a specific method called restorative justice. What restorative justice is it's a set of practices around how to create a school climate, one that prevents violence and crimes from happening rather than simply responding to them like the zero tolerance laws did. And then once it does actually happen, the response is very different. It's not mandatory, it's flexible, and there are a lot of ways that it tries to address the underlying causes of the crime or the violence rather than just exacting some sort of retributive punishment on the transgressor. One of the ways that restorative justice really tries to work is by preventing school violence from occurring in the first place, and the way it does this is through a practice called restorative circles as well as general community building. It's important to note that restorative justice is not really a new invention. It is a new name for a practice that American Indians have been using for thousands of years. This is really something that was inspired by smaller communities that focused on dialogue amongst their members. So the beginning of this really is in these restorative circles, building community among your students before anything happens. And the way that you do that is by introducing them to a lot of these practices, having everyone sit in a circle, guiding them with questions that are meant to gradually lead them to greater and greater self-reflection and greater ability to share with their peers. Guidelines are a really important part of this process, so establishing group norms, establishing group values, having a talking stick, and also making sure that the teacher who's facilitating these is not just a teacher, not just some sort of director of the cycle, but actually a positive model and a member of the circle. So they're also sharing, they are part of this community, they're not someone from on high enforcing these rules upon the students, but someone who's modeling how to participate positively in the community and in the circles and in the discussions that they're meant to provoke. Circles can be, again, just baseline community building, goofy sort of sharing at the beginning of the school year, or they can actually develop into addressing something that's going on at school. That kind of circle, where it's addressing something that's going on at school, is still different from an actual restorative justice circle, which is meant to focus on bringing together the transgressor and the victims of any sort of incident that might happen. So this might be something talking about greater national dialogue or something like that, like what we see in terms of school violence on the news. That would actually be a really excellent topic for discussion in a circle later in the school year after you've built up a lot of trust, after you've really established strong guidelines and strong practices with your students. So the other part of restorative justice is what happens in response to an incident when it actually does occur. And that is a dialogue that involves a lot of preparation. It involves actually a moderator who will, first of all, reach out to both parties, make sure that they're willing to participate, because you can't force anyone to be part of a restorative justice practice. once they're both willing to participate, there's a lot of groundwork laid about how, what the needs of the different parties involved are, and what's necessary to make sure that this is a safe interaction. Ultimately, what you hope comes out of one of these dialogues is that the needs of the victim are met. This focuses on healing and mending the harm that was done, rather than just punishing the transgressor and kind of treating the state or the school as the thing that was harmed. Oh, you transgressed our law, therefore you must be punished. And in our laws, actually, right now, in our cases, people who are brought up against charges are often charged as versus the state, versus, and so this really does shift focus back onto the people who are actually affected by the crime. Or this dialogue is also meant to address the needs of the transgressor, of the offender, and look at why was this something that happened in the first place, and how can you participate in mending this harm. So hopefully what comes out of a restorative dialogue is a contract of sorts between the parties that were involved, that lays out an actionable plan that has very detailed specifics about how the harm will be repaired, what will happen if the harm is not repaired in the way that these parties agreed upon, and exactly what the limitations, the timeline around all of this is. So it's not some vague, like, he will repair the fence, but he will show up after school on these days for this amount of time and work for this many hours total in order to repair the fence. However, the funds to repair the fence will be provided by X. So it's really, really detailed, and it focuses a lot on, one, why did this happen, and two, what's an actual response to this that's not just punishment. So this is the really big difference between these zero policy laws, is it addresses the root underlying causes through this dialogue and through providing a chance for the offender to actually talk to the victim and say, like, oh, and see the impact of their crime, and also to express themselves about why this happened. And it gives more closure to the victim, and it doesn't just remove the offender from the system. So we'll see that that doesn't really work in terms of reducing violence. So there have been multiple studies that actually show that incarceration either doesn't reduce the rate of recidivism or potentially increases that risk. So a study of California youth looked at the rates of recidivism within 3 years. So recidivism is being readmitted into the justice system for youth who had stays in the juvenile justice system from 3 months to 13 months. And they were almost exactly equal. So this length of stay thing did not at all decrease their chances of being readmitted. What did decrease their chances of being readmitted was them growing up and maturing, receiving treatment for substance abuse, and changes in life situations. At the same time, so serious youth offenders who are placed into justice facilities in California in the Department of Justice for an average of 36.2 months, they actually return to the Department of Justice facilities. There's an 80% chance of them returning. So it really doesn't seem to be something that reduces the risk of reoffending, this sort of incarceration method. There have, however, been several metadata studies that have shown a reduction in recidivism for youth who participated in restorative justice programs versus those who were in the traditional justice programs. This is looking at youth who have been incarcerated typically, and then they participate in a restorative justice program as part of that incarceration. So there is a lot of difficulties in how we get this data, but the data is really promising. It showed on average lower rates of recidivism. One study in 2005 showed lower rates of recidivism, and another study in 2007 showed that the effect of this sort of intervention program was almost double that of traditional justice programs. So there's a lot to look forward to, and hopefully as this becomes more and more prevalent in schools, we'll get more and more data about how this changes school climates and not just recidivism rates in terms of youth who are being incarcerated. But it's something that's really promising to look forward to.